A new study says that if you have high cholesterol, you need to be cutting your carbs and not your saturated fat. Get the full details today here on Jimmy Rants. Click on that little box down in the corner. It'll take you straight to IGTV for today's episode. JimmyRants.com is the website. And as always, you can engage live in the content, but you got to go follow me over on Instagram. I am at Living Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you're there, engage live and have fun with the show. We do go live Monday through Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, so check it out. Be there, be square. You can also see it, and thank you to the simulcast over on YouTube. Thank you guys for watching here today, as well as my YouTube video screen. Facebook, YouTube. I think I called you YouTube. Your Facebook. Anyway, thank you for being here. However you're watching this, if you're watching it in the stratosphere, wherever you watch it, thank you for watching today on Jimmy Rants. If you missed the live, you can watch it on replay over on IGTV. Shortly after this is over, it goes up on IGTV pretty quick, like right away. We also throw the past episodes up over on YouTube. Just type in a keyword Jimmy Rants, you'll find the show, or youtube.com/livinglowcarbman. And then Tuesdays, which is what today is, we air a Best of Jimmy Rants podcast over on my flagship show, the Living La Vida Low Carb Show. Today I have the audio where I talked about that new study that kind of vindicated saturated fat. So really important study that came out recently in the American College of Cardiology journal, and so go listen to that. If you missed that episode of Jimmy Rants, you can go listen to it at llvlc.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. And then finally go to jimmyrants.com for all the past episodes of this show. And yeah, while you're there, click on the Patreon link. Any donation would be greatly appreciated. Okay, you guys, you know that I have been talking about cholesterol and its impact on your health for many years. I wrote a whole book about it. In fact, here it is, called Cholesterol Clarity: What the HDL is Wrong with My Numbers. And in this book, I make the case that it's not a high-fat diet that is causing heart disease. It is not saturated fat in your diet clogging your arteries, even though all of those imageries is what people have in their head when they start thinking about saturated fat. I have long made the contention that it's the carbohydrates that are the problem. And we've had some decent studies put out there in the past that kind of identifies carbohydrate as the culprit. Now, even in the midst of those studies, we're still having dietitians and doctors and all kinds of people still articulate this whole idea that somehow saturated fats are harming your heart health because supposedly they're raising your cholesterol, and supposedly that higher cholesterol meaning you have an increased risk of heart disease. Can I tell you a little secret? None of that has been found to be true. Eating saturated fat does not increase your risk of heart disease. And in fact, I would dare say it's just the opposite. The more saturated fat you eat in the context of a carbohydrate restricted diet, the healthier your heart will be, regardless of what your cholesterol is. I've got another study that came out that I want to talk about. I don't know if I'll have time to do it here today, but about heart calcium scores and how you can see whether that high cholesterol is actually something to be concerned about or not. They argue in that study that it's not something to be concerned about and that actual signs of disease is. I will get to that one soon if I run out of time here today with this one. But I have a study, you guys, that just came out. It's literally all over the news today. I've seen a lot of my friends in the low-carb keto space talking about this. I printed this out 3 days ago and have had it on tap to talk to you guys about. But it's big. And it talks about those people who have the genetic condition called familial hypercholesterolemia. Don't let the big, long, fancy words bother you. Basically, all that means is familial, meaning it's hereditary, and hypercholesterolemia, hyper, high, cholesterol, and emia, a tendency for high cholesterol. That's literally, it's a genetic family history of having high cholesterol. It's totally predicated by your genes. And so one of the researchers in this study is somebody I know very, very well. I know several of the researchers in this study. Dr. David Diamond. I have met David. He is a wonderful, wonderful guy. I had him on the Live and La Vida Low Carb show over a decade ago talking about his story of how he got into the cholesterol research and how messed up he noticed that it was. And so David had high triglycerides, and he went on a low carb diet to bring his hypertriglycerolemia down, and he did. He did it like a champ, and he did it through carbohydrate restriction. So since then, since his own transformation, he has been on a rampage trying to articulate to people that cholesterol is not the grand enemy in your health, and that the messages we're being given nutritionally about cholesterol are not what they seem. So also on this study are other familiar names you might know. Zoe Harcum, who is from the UK. Malcolm Kendrick, who's from Scotland. Asim Malhotra, another cardiologist from the UK. Uffe Ravenscoff, who's from Sweden, has long been a cholesterol skeptic. And Dr. Jeff Volek, who is one of the preeminent researchers in the ketogenic space. They all, along with others, wrote this paper. It was published in BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine. That's the name of the journal. And it's just out, you guys. It literally just came out in that journal. David is the lead author on this study. And the name of the study, Dietary Recommendations for Familial Hypercholesterolemia and Evidence-Free Zone. So there it is. Whenever I read these studies, everybody wants to know, what the title is, how they can get a copy of it. So go look up Dietary Recommendations for Familial Hypercholesterolemia and Evidence-Free Zone. Was published in the journal BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine, and it's in July of 2020. So this is literally hot off the presses. There was a little bit of a press release kind of thing. I'll read from that, and then I'll get directly into the study. So yeah, if you're just joining us, brand new study that says if you've got high cholesterol, you don't need to be cutting your saturated fat, even though that's the message that's been put out there for years. Cut your fat, cut your fat, cut your fat. No. If you want to improve high cholesterol, then you need to be cutting your carbs. For decades, people diagnosed with familial hypercholesterolemia have been instructed to minimize their consumption of saturated fats in order to lower cholesterol and reduce their risk of heart disease. But a brand new study published in the prestigious journal BMJ, which stands for British Medical Journal, Evidence-Based Medicine, found that no evidence supports these claims. Familial hypercholesterolemia is a genetic disorder that causes people to have cholesterol that could be upwards of 2 to 4 times higher than the average person. So the average person, let's just say, has 200 to 250. So someone with FH, familial hypercholesterolemia, could see 500, 700, 900, even 1,000 in their total cholesterol. Organizations like the American Heart Association have long suggested that people that have high cholesterol avoid foods from animal sources, such as meat, eggs, and cheese, as well as to avoid coconut oil. What do all of those foods contain? Lots of saturated fat. An international team of experts on heart disease and diet, including 5 cardiologists, are in this paper I'm about to read from you. They reviewed the dietary guidelines for people with familial hypercholesterolemia. They say they couldn't find any justification for health experts to recommend a low saturated fat diet. So the lead researcher is David Diamond. He is a professor and heart disease researcher at the University of South Florida. He says for the past 80 years, people with FH have been told to lower their cholesterol with a low saturated fat diet. Our study shows that a more heart-healthy diet is one that is low in sugar and not one that's low in saturated fat. Diamond and his co-authors say if you follow a low-carb diet, that is the most effective way for people at an increased risk of heart disease, such as those who are overweight, hypertensive, and diabetic. Their findings are consistent with another paper recently that is airing on the Live and La Vida Low Carb show today. Again, go check it out, llvlc.com. But it was published in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, which provided strong evidence that foods that raise blood sugar, such as bread, potatoes, and sweets, should be minimized rather than tropical oils like coconut oil and animal-based foods. So the citation, if you're looking it up, again, BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine, July of 2020, David Diamond et al., Dietary Recommendations for Familial Hypercholesterolemia and Evidence-Free Zone. So let's get into the paper itself, because this is juicy. And this is going to make the mainstream kind of heart health and dietary people lose their lunch, because for the longest time, they have ridden the wave of saturated fat being the boogeyman in your health. And I think it's a convenient out for them to just point the finger at saturated fat without ever having to provide any kind of evidence that saturated fat was a culprit whatsoever. Can I tell you the secret? It never was. It never has been. It's always been the sugar. It's always been the foods that turn to sugar in the body, all carbohydrates. That's what they're not telling people. I posted on my Instagram stories just today a mainstream news article that talked about diabetics. And it's like, oh yeah, if you want to help with your diabetes, a very low-fat diet full of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, are we still on that? Like, seriously? Because they were still pointing the finger. Oh, animal-based foods are horrible. Blah, blah. Okay, thank you for your opinion, but there's no science that backs that up. Now, we're seeing a lot of science that's proving exactly the opposite. That having more saturated fat is actually helpful, and less carbohydrate is actually helpful. Not more carbs and less fat, more fat and less carbs. So let's get into this. Abstract. We have evaluated dietary recommendations for people who are diagnosed with familial hypercholesterolemia, FH, a genetic condition in which increased low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, LDL, is associated with an increased risk for coronary heart disease, CHD. Recommendations for FH individuals have emphasized a low saturated fat, low cholesterol diet to reduce their LDL-C levels. Here's the funny thing. 5 years ago, in the 2015 dietary guidelines, they announced that cholesterol, meaning dietary cholesterol that you would consume, cholesterol is no longer a nutrient of concern, meaning they stopped putting limitations on the amount of cholesterol that you consume. And yet for FH patients, they're still recommending you limit your cholesterol consumption, because they found that eating dietary cholesterol has no impact on your blood cholesterol levels, because the body is very smart. If you eat more cholesterol, the endogenous production of cholesterol slows down. And if you eat less exogenous cholesterol in the diet, the endogenous ramps up. They try to keep a homeostasis of your cholesterol so that you could eat a crap load of cholesterol and it's not going to impact your blood cholesterol levels much at all. I remember Dr. Steve Finney back there on the wall, he did an experiment one time where he ate 19 eggs in one sitting. He was trying to prove a point because eggs are full of dietary cholesterol. And he tested his total cholesterol before, and then he ate the 19 eggs and let an obligate amount of time pass, and then he tested his cholesterol again. You want to know how much his cholesterol went up? It did go up. 3 points. 3 points. So if dietary cholesterol ends up in the bloodstream as free-floating cholesterol in your body, wouldn't it have gone up more than 3 points? You would think, but it didn't, because again, when the body senses that you're putting exogenous sources via food of cholesterol into it, it downregulates the endogenous production of that cholesterol. And yet, for FH patients, they're still telling them, eat a low cholesterol, low saturated fat diet. The basis of this recommendation is the diet heart hypothesis, which you've heard me talk about many times before, was based on a lie. Ansel Keys totally lied with the 7-country study because it wasn't a 7-country study. It was a 26-country study, And if he published the 26-country study, it would have been, it would have been such a jagged gobbledygook of no correlation whatsoever, he could not have published anything. Okay? So that diet heart hypothesis, which you see the lingering effects of it still in 2020, is the diet recommended for people with familial hypercholesterolemia is still low fat, low cholesterol based on that failed diet heart hypothesis. That hypothesis postulates that the consumptions of foods rich in saturated fat increases your cholesterol levels in the blood, which then increases your risk of coronary heart disease. We have challenged the rationale for FH dietary recommendations based on the absence of support for this hypothesis. Yeah, tell me about it. It has no scientific efficacy whatsoever. And the lack of evidence that a low saturated fat, low cholesterol diet reduces coronary events in FH individuals. This is the thing. It would be so easy to do a study about this. If you think lowering saturated fat and lowering dietary cholesterol does something for people who have high cholesterol on a genetic level, like FH patients, and that by extension of lowering of the cholesterol then gives benefit to outcomes of heart attacks, heart disease, and the like, then show us the evidence. Guess what, guys? They've never done those studies because they know this is a lie from the start. So you don't want to put out a study that you already know the answer is not what you want to see. So as an alternative approach, we have summarized the research which has shown that the subset of FH individuals that develop coronary heart disease or exhibit risk factors associated with an insulin-resistant phenotype. And so listen to this. These are the people who end up getting heart attacks that have this FH. They blame it on the saturated fat, but listen to all these conditions that are the telltale sign. Elevated triglycerides. How did triglycerides go up? Carbohydrate consumptions. High blood glucose. How does glucose go up? Carbohydrate consumption. Hemoglobin A1C, your A1C number. How does that go up? Carbohydrates. Obesity. How do you get obese? Some would say it's the overconsumption of calories and mostly fat calories, but we know that one of the major causal factors is an excess of sugars and grains. Hyperinsulinemia. How do you get high insulin? Carbohydrates. High sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is a key inflammation marker. How do you increase inflammation? Two things, carbohydrates and seed oils, the so-called vegetable oil. So if you cook in corn oil, soybean oil, which is in every kind of sauce these days, canola oil, any of these so-called healthy oils, the American Heart Association puts their heart health symbol on. Yeah, you can bet that those are not healthy and they are increasing HSCRP levels. And then hypertension, which is high blood pressure. Again, all of these a symptom of eating higher amounts of carbohydrate. You also have an increased susceptibility to developing coagulopathy. All right, David is using some fancy schmancy term, but it can't be good. The insulin-resistant phenotype, also referred to as metabolic syndrome, manifests as carbohydrate intolerance. Don't miss this. If you have insulin resistance, if you have metabolic syndrome, you have a carbohydrate intolerance. Now, that's not to say everybody needs to cut carbs, but if you have these conditions that I just described with the high triglycerides, high blood sugar, high A1C, obesity, hyperinsulinemia, high sensitivity C-reactive protein, and hypertension, then probably you are a candidate for cutting down on your carbs because you obviously are very intolerant, especially to the culprit refined carbohydrates. And then over time you can heal that so that maybe you can add back in whole food forms of carbohydrates later. But in the here and now, when you're in the disease state, the insulin resistant state, the metabolic syndrome state, it might be more beneficial for you to cut those down in the meantime. Therefore, we are proposing that FH individuals with signs of insulin resistance should be made aware of all the benefits of a low-carb diet. Our assessment of the literature provides the rationale for clinical trials to be conducted to determine if an LCD, low carb diet, would prove to be effective in reducing the incidence of coronary events in people with FH, which exhibit an insulin resistant phenotype risk. So, all that to say is if you have a FH and you have all these different symptoms, which we just described, then you're probably a prime candidate for cutting your carbs, not your saturated fat. And this is where the researchers in the past and the clinicians that push a low-fat diet, low-saturated fat diet, have gotten it so wrong. They have failed to see that insulin resistance is the X factor here. And the sad part is most people who are dealing with obesity and other kind of health issues from a blood marker perspective, they need carbohydrate restriction, and yet they're not getting that. Usually what happens to those people is they put them on some kind of a medication to control these various things. The problem is there's no medication that lowers triglycerides. There's some medications that manage your insulin, there's some that manage your blood sugar, but the problem is if you're not getting to the root cause of why those things are high to begin with, diet, then no drug in the world is going to mitigate that continuation of the crappy diet. Introduction. In a compelling editorial, Stephen Nissen, the chair of the Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic, stated current and past U.S. dietary guidelines represent a near evidence-free zone, and that a consequence of the promotion of the low-fat, low-cholesterol diet, type 2 diabetes has grown into an epidemic. He asserted that dietary recommendations should be based on the same quality of evidence that we demand in other fields of medicine. We have applied his call for evidence-based dietary guidelines to the routine dietary recommendations given to individuals with FH, which is a genetic predisposition for high LDL, which is also associated with an increased incidence of coronary heart disease. The issue that we have addressed is whether dietary recommendations for FH, which promote the cardiovascular benefits of eating a low cholesterol, low saturated fat diet, are based on strong empirical support or exist in the context of an evidence-free zone. In other words, they have basically put out these guidelines of eating low cholesterol, low saturated fat. They have never once had to present the evidence of where they came up with that. It's an evidence-free zone indeed. Like they've never had to prove that their recommendations have efficacy. And the problem is most patients have no idea. They just obediently follow. And if you obediently follow someone who cannot provide evidence for why they're saying the things that they're saying, especially from an authoritative position, I mean, most people won't even question it. And that's part of the problem as well. Now that's starting to change, and it's why they did this paper here today, is they wanted to say, hey, look, there are better ways to do things that are based on the evidence. Historical perspective on dietary recommendations for F8. So let's find out how we got these recommendations of super low fat, low saturated fat, super low cholesterol diets. In 1939, Muller provided the first documentation of premature heart disease in people diagnosed with FH in conjunction with dietary guidance. He recommended patients consume a diet poor in cholesterol, meaning no egg yolks, butter, cream, fat milk, or other fat of animal origin. However, in a note of caution, he stated there was no empirical basis to formulate any opinion in regard to the effects of this diet. 50 years later, Connor and Connor praised Muller for recommending dietary cholesterol and animal fat as necessary restrictions in people with FH. However, did not address his concerns that the presumed benefits of the diet had not been confirmed in any kind of randomized controlled trial. Indeed, when the Connors praised Muller's guidance for FH, there had not been one single RCT reporting coronary event benefits from the diet that had then at that point become the standard for all FH individuals. So see, 1939, we have the first documentation, and he cuts their fat just on a whim, thinking, okay, maybe this will help. Never once did it get studied. Never once was it put through the processes of what good science is. And I've talked about this quite a bit on Jimmy Rants over the years, you guys, of trying to get you guys to understand all studies are not the same. Randomized controlled trials, RCTs, are literally that gold standard by which studies should be conducted. Now, it doesn't mean other studies don't have any veracity at all. Epidemiological, observational, animal-based types of studies are all good hypothesis building studies, but they're not really telling you a whole lot. If you see a study that says, oh, we fed rats saturated fat and it made their heart health improve by 25%, don't think that means that in humans eating saturated fat is going to improve your heart health by 25%. That's not what that study shows, unless your name is Mighty Mouse. Here I come to save the day. No, what it means is they saw it in a mouse study. Okay, now we have a hypothesis. Feed more saturated fat, improves your heart health by 25%. Okay, let's do a randomized controlled trial in humans and see if we replicate the same results we did in the animal. That's how good science works. Dietary guidance for FH individuals has not changed in the 3 decades since the Connors praised the value of a low saturated fat, low cholesterol diet. It hasn't. It stayed exactly the same. Again, predicated on a whole lot of nothing. Never founded in any kind of science, and yet it's become the standard of care for people on FH. Examples of contemporary recommendations for familial hypercholesterolemia include Debisi, who urged FH individuals to consume lean meat, remove skin from the poultry, select reduced fat cheese and milk, avoid coconut and palm oils, butter, sour cream, lard, and ghee. Dietary recommendations in the 2018 American Heart Association cholesterol guidelines stated that FH individuals should follow an LDL-lowering heart-healthy diet. I always hate that heart-healthy diet. Who came up with that term and thought it meant something positive? Heart-healthy? Heart-healthy, you guys, if you ever see that on any kind of food product, oh, this is a heart-healthy diet, it's code for we took all the saturated fat out of the product. That's literally all heart-healthy means. It limits animal and vegetable sources of saturated fat, especially the consumption of low-fat dairy and those that cause clots to lyse, which is called fibrinolysis. There is extensive evidence at cellular, metabolic, and genetic levels of analysis that the homeostatic balance in familial hypercholesterolemia is shifted towards hypercoagulation. These findings were reviewed by Ravenskopf et al., who found that there was a strong evidence of hypercoagulation and not LDL-C as the key cause of CHD in FH. A subset of the literature is provided. So he has a lot of little graphs here. I don't want to get too deep in the woods on this. But the bottom line is it wasn't the saturated fat that was the culprit that then raised your LDL. No, it was other factors that were brought on from the carbohydrate consumption. Platelets from FH individuals are more sensitive than those of non-FH individuals to aggregate in response to epinephrine. This finding suggests that those with FH would develop a greater thrombotic reaction to the stress than those without FH. Extremely high levels of fibrinogen, a primary clotting factor and risk factor for coronary heart disease, are found in homogeneous FH individuals. Homogeneous meaning from one parent. Heterogeneous would be from both parents, which have a high incidence of early CHD-related mortality. High levels of fibrinogen also distinguish the subset of this heterozygous FH individual, as well as people without FH who have coronary disease, from those without coronary disease. Getting a little bit complicated. Sorry, I'm trying to read and interpret at the same time. The bottom line is it's these high levels of fibrinogen that's causing the problems with the clotting that then people start having issues with their heart health. Nothing at all to do with the saturated fat or the cholesterol that they're consuming. Nothing. And yet they want to point the blame at that. Genetic factors can influence homeostatic balance. For example, prothrombotic gene polymorphisms such as prothrombin 2210A increases the risk of MI in the myocardial infarction is what MI stands for in the general population. FH individuals with this exhibit more than twice the rate of coronary events in FH individuals without it, and effect was independent of their LDL. So no matter what their LDL was, which we're being told, eat more saturated fat, eat more dietary cholesterol is going to raise your LDL, and that's what causes these. No. They're showing you can have these increases in the problems with the heart apart from whatever the LDL is. So again, if the causal factor, which is what they've been teaching us for so long, is higher LDL, how does this happen when the LDL, regardless of what the LDL is, they can have low LDL, they can have a moderate level of LDL. It doesn't matter. It has nothing to do with the LDL. People with FH who smoke exhibit a shift in this balance toward thrombosis compared to the ones that are non-smokers. Previous research has demonstrated that familial hypercholesterolemia smokers exhibited a decreased forearm vasodilatory response to reactive hyperemia, increased inflammation, and an imbalanced thrombosis compared with non-smokers. Again, that's smoking. Has nothing to do with the LDL, and yet that's a complication that leads to some of these heart issues. Other biomarkers of hypofibrinolysis in people with FH, with and without coronary heart disease, they found significantly higher levels of tissue plasminogen activator antigen and the PA inhibitor 1 antigen. Sorry for all the gobbledygook kind of terms, but it's making a bigger point here, so stick with me. In those with FH, the shift of homeostatic balance from fibrinolysis towards hypercoagulation was independent of their LDL. Again, all those things I just mentioned, the point is LDL was not the causal factor. Okay? So they want us to believe that higher LDL, which comes from consuming more saturated fat, comes from consuming more dietary cholesterol, is what is the causal factor in these people with high cholesterol levels at a genetic level, is the causal factor in why they get heart disease. And it clearly is not. Non-lipid CHD risk factors, so people with familial hypercholesterolemia are susceptible to these non-lipid coronary heart disease risk factors just in the same way as non-familial hypercholesterolemia individuals. So the following is a subset of the literature that documents this. Galima Bors et al. Demonstrated that people with FH with hypertension had more than twice the incidence of CHD than non-hypertensive FH individuals, despite having the exact same LDL. Minami et al. Found that FH individuals with a high coronary calcium score, so that's that score. And again, I have another article that I won't be able to get to today, but I definitely want to get to, that talks about this a little more. You want that number low, the heart scan score, the heart calcium score. But those who had a high one, which is a high reliable marker of coronary heart disease, had significantly greater levels of, get this, fasting blood glucose than those who had low coronary calcium score. Pretty interesting. And again, apart from their LDL. We also have FH individuals of abdominal obesity and hyperinsulinemia exhibited dramatically greater incidence of this, again, independent of LDL. Ye et al. Found that patients with FH with detectable coronary calcium had significantly increased high sensitivity C-reactive protein, HSCRP, which is a key inflammation markers, again, apart from LDL. Are you sensing a pattern here? There's so many other things that are going on here that have nothing at all to do with the LDL level. A subset of these individuals displayed elevated triglycerides in addition to an increase in the LDL, and the susceptibility of these people to develop CHD is influenced by genetics and obesity. They exhibit a significantly higher rate of this myocardial infarction and FH individuals with low levels of triglycerides despite having equal LDL. So hypertriglyceridemia and obesity, totally apart from the LDL, is a subset of FH individuals, and it increases their susceptibility to heart disease. So all of those are studies, you guys, of examples of where LDL didn't even come into play in the conversation. And yet, what do we hear from mainstream health officials and researchers? We need to cut our saturated fat. We need to cut our dietary cholesterol. And for what purpose? To lower LDL. And thus, by lowering LDL, we improve heart health. And it's based on a big fat lie. Has no evidence. No evidence. Like, how did they get away with this for so long? They got away with it because there's people that turned a blind eye to what the science was showing, or in this case, what no science was showing. Good scientists should have said, whoa, before we give recommendations to the public, I think we want to try to look at, is there evidence for what we're saying? And there never was any evidence, you guys. No evidence whatsoever was ever presented that showed cutting your saturated fat and cutting your dietary cholesterol led to any kind of positive results in heart health. And yet, what is the total way that they try to pitch people cutting their fat and cutting their cholesterol in their diet? It has everything to do with lowering your cholesterol, specifically your LDL, and by extension of that, you will improve your heart health. All of us believe that in our lives. A lot of us are becoming awakened to that now, what a big fat lie that was, but we all believed it at one point. All right, so I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds in this. I do want to bring up this thing called lipoprotein little a. It's one of the most robust of all markers of CHD risk in people with FH and non-FH. Lipoprotein little a, LP little a, contains a plasmogen-like glycoprotein known as allolipoprotein, which is bound to the allolipoprotein B100 of an LDL particle. Elevated levels of lipoprotein little a are more closely associated with coronary heart disease than LDL. So there was a study by Seed et al. It showed that FH individuals with CHD had significantly greater levels of lipoprotein little a compared with FH without it. The association of lipoprotein little a with this in people with FH was independent of LDL. So if you've never run your lipoprotein little a, it's a very easy blood test to run. There's a lot of interesting data about lipoprotein little a, and I'm wondering still if they're going to continue to do research on it, what it means to have a higher lipoprotein little a in the context of lower triglycerides, higher HDL, low inflammation markers like hsCRP. That'll be interesting to see because I tend to have higher level of lipoprotein little a. And I have a family history in my family of heart disease. But I have all those other things going on. Low triglycerides, high HDL, low hsCRP, single digit insulin. So it's going to be interesting to watch how that all develops. Alrighty, cardiovascular risk markers summary. Almost a century ago, the finding that a subset of FH individuals developed heart disease led to the assumption that it was their elevated total cholesterol, and then later they changed it to the LDL cholesterol alone, that increased their susceptibility to it. However, more sophisticated contemporary research has demonstrated that those with FH are just as, perhaps even more susceptible to the same non-lipid risk factors that contribute to cardiovascular disease in the general population. Overall, these findings provide strong evidence that there is a subset of people with FH who are at increased risk of cardiovascular disease because they are susceptible to diet, lifestyle, metabolic, and genetic risk factors, which are all independent of their high LDL. In other words, they made assumptions that weren't based on anything and that there's other factors at play. I hope you're getting that from this paper, that so many other factors are involved that go beyond the LDL-C number that are probably leading people with FH and even people without FH to have higher levels of heart disease. It has nothing to do with their LDL. So what's the influence of diet on heart disease risk biomarkers? Here's the juicy part, you guys. You've been waiting on this all Jimmy Rants. We're finally there. Aside from the consensus on the hazards of excess sugar and trans fat consumption, there is a lack of agreement on how other dietary components influence the incidence of hard cardiovascular events, such as stroke, myocardial infarction, or death. This state of uncertainty was addressed by DeBruff and DeLorgrill, who reported that dietary randomized controlled trials have rarely demonstrated significant benefits in hard cardiovascular outcomes. Moreover, objections have been raised against recommendations on restricting saturated fat. Therefore, despite decades of research on diet and cardiovascular disease, there is so little consensus on how consumption of different food categories contributes causally to the development of CHD. An alternative approach to understanding how diet affects this is with the assessment of how macronutrients, specifically the ratio of carbohydrate to fat in the diet, affects surrogate biomarkers which are associated with coronary events. This approach has been studied extensively in many randomized controlled trials which have assessed CHD relevant biomarkers in response to things like a low carb diet compared to a low fat diet. RCTs have demonstrated that improvement in CHD biomarkers with a low carb diet is equivalent and in most measures superior to biomarker modifications with a low fat diet. In other words, we've been told the low fat diet is the bee's knees in improving all your cardiovascular or what's called the cardiometabolic risks and all those markers that are involved in that. We've been told a low fat diet does that. They found that a low carb diet not only performs as well as the low fat diet in some areas, it's even better in other areas. And we know a prime example is triglycerides. You want to lower your triglycerides? It's going to be extremely hard on a low fat diet because it tends to be a higher carb diet. And it's the carbs that are directly driving those triglycerides higher and higher and higher, especially in those people with insulin resistance metabolic syndrome. So if you tell someone with insulin resistance and high cholesterol and blah, 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 to go on a low saturated fat diet, the default of a low saturated fat diet is to eat a higher carb diet. And then their triglycerides go crazy. So their LDL will probably go down on the low fat diet. And there's a lot of reasons for that we talk about in my book, Cholesterol Clarity. But their triglycerides go higher. And that high triglycerides is the truly bad fat in the blood. One example of a benefit of a low-carb diet on your CHD risk is in the abatement of hypertension via a diet-mediated reduction of your insulin and your glucose levels. Specifically, high insulin in people with type 2 diabetes promotes renal sodium retention, which can then contribute to hypertension and myocardial hypertrophy. Two recent long-term clinical trials have shown that over the course of 2 years, low-carb diets resulted in significant and substantial reductions in blood pressure, as well as lowering triglycerides, glucose levels, and insulin levels. Historically, lipoprotein little a has been viewed as a genetically determined marker of your cardiovascular risk, and they say it's unaffected by diet. However, this perspective on lipoprotein little a was based solely on studies conducted on individuals eating a low-fat diet, which does not affect the LP little a. It actually increases it. Low-carb diets, by contrast, though, is the only dietary approach shown to significantly reduce your lipoprotein little a, which is an effective way to reduce your risk of coronary heart disease in people with familial hypercholesterolemia. Are you getting the picture here? A lot of the assumptions we make in health and in looking at health markers and in determining like health ranges for various markers, it's of people who eat a low-fat diet. It's all through the prism of a low-fat diet, not people on a low-carb diet. Which means we need to rewrite all of these assumptions that we have about things based on a low-carb diet. It's kind of like the whole LDL goes up in a subset of people who eat a ketogenic diet. I'm one of those people. When I went keto, my LDL went higher. oh man, that's like increasing your risk of heart disease because under the old paradigm of looking at LDL went up. Oh my God. And the problem is scientists can't explain what that means or if it means anything. It's why scientists are looking more at triglyceride to HDL ratio, insulin levels, glucose levels, inflammation levels. Those are all much, much better markers of determining where you are in your state of heart health than your LDL and your total cholesterol. They don't have near the punch or the meaning that they think they do. And so it's interesting, they're noting in here that, oh, they didn't think lipoprotein a could move at all with diet because low-fat diet didn't move it, but a low-carb diet moved it greatly. Pretty interesting, huh? It's noteworthy that the basis of the diet heart hypothesis was that the consumption of foods rich in saturated fat would increase your risk of heart disease. But in a randomized controlled trial by Wood et al., subjects in the low-carb diet group exhibited superior improvements in all the key risk factors of heart disease as compared with the low-fat diet group, despite the low-carb diet having consumed more than 3 times as much saturated fat as those in the low-fat diet. One final issue is whether FH individuals respond in an aberrant manner to a low-carb diet. Cole et al. Assessed this issue by studying the effects of a moderate low-carb diet. In other words, their low-carb diet was 30% of calories, high fat of 55%, supplemented with up to 1,800 milligrams a day of cholesterol coming mostly from eggs on serum lipid levels. Those investigators reported the consumption of additional fat and cholesterol in the context of low triglycerides and higher HDL did not affect their LDL at all. This study demonstrated that people with FH responded to a low-carb, high-fat, high-cholesterol diet in the same manner as a non-FH individual. In other words, it didn't impact LDL at all. They were fearful of that, but it didn't happen. In summary, the low-carb diet has beneficial effects on well-established risk factors for heart disease, including small, dense LDL particles, which I've talked about many times on Jimmy Rants. Run an NMR lipoprofile test. So LipoScience in North Carolina runs this test, and it will break down the size of the LDL particles. And you want very, very low levels of small, dense LDL. HDL, which ideally should be over 50 at the bare minimum. Optimally, you want it over 70. Triglycerides, if you eat a low-carb diet, will definitely be under 100. And optimally, you want under 70. Lipoprotein a, it's a tricky one because some people can have higher levels and then they go on a ketogenic diet and they start to come down. Also, I saw my lipoprotein a drop by 250 plus points from a 1-week fast. So fasting, keto, there's things that you can do to mitigate some of these markers that can be out of whack. Body weight, inflammatory markers like hsCRP, fasting glucose, insulin levels and sensitivity, HbA1c, and blood pressure. So all good markers that a low-carb diet has shown to help with. Pretty cool, huh? So, summary of the evidence-based dietary recommendations for FH. Dietary recommendations for heart disease prevention in people with FH for the past 8 decades have focused on targeting cholesterol reduction with low fat, low cholesterol. However, these recommendations are based largely on the antiquated and evidence-free diet heart hypothesis. We have proposed that a revision of these dietary recommendations for people with FH is justified based on all the substantial evidence that a subset of these individuals that develops heart disease exhibit risk factors such as enhanced thrombotic risk and a heightened sensitivity to risk factors like the insulin-resistant phenotype, which we talked about earlier. Our assessment of the literature is consistent with the conclusions of other studies which have done systematic reviews and meta-analysis of LCD, which is low-carb diet, and cardiovascular risk. Large RCTs of at least 6 months duration with carbohydrate restriction appear superior in improving lipid markers when compared to a low-fat diet. Dietary guidelines should consider carbohydrate restriction as an alternative dietary strategy for the prevention and management of dyslipidemia for populations who have a cardiometabolic risk. Therefore, the evidence basis is sufficiently strong to provide the rationale for clinical trials to be conducted to determine if a low-carb diet would prove to be effective in reducing the incidence of coronary events in those with FH with an insulin-resistant phenotype or increased thrombotic risk. So, the bottom line here, you guys, we need to be looking at a low-carb diet for those people who have genetically high levels of cholesterol, or if you just have high levels of cholesterol without it being a genetic issue. We need to be looking at the insulin resistance of these people. And let's see all those markers. And again, I'll go over them. High triglycerides, high blood glucose, a high HbA1c, abdominal obesity, high insulin, HSCRP, the inflammation marker, low HDL, and hypertension or high blood pressure. If someone exhibits those and they have high cholesterol, high total cholesterol, then we need to be looking at a low-carb diet for those people. We need to stop having this across the board. Well, they have high total cholesterol, high LDL, therefore they need a low saturated fat, low cholesterol. Not for people that are exhibiting insulin resistance. Those people, more than any other group, need a low-carb ketogenic diet, which is the point of this study. So a summary of their recommendations and their points. Current dietary guidelines for management of coronary heart disease in familial hypercholesterolemia are based on the diet heart hypothesis, which is outdated and unsupported. There's no evidence to support these recommendations of consuming a low saturated fat, low cholesterol diet. A low-carb diet significantly improves cardiovascular disease risk markers compared with low-fat diet, and there's sufficient evidence for conducting clinical trials on the effects of a low-carb diet on people with insulin resistance who have FH, and extensive research has documented all of this previously. So, good stuff, you guys. Again, this was published in BMJ Evidence-Based Medicine in July of 2020, Dietary Recommendations for Familial Hypercholesterolemia and Evidence-Free Zone. Go check it out. But I want to see what you guys have to say because we're quickly running out of time. That was a long one, but I wanted to make sure we got in all the details there. So welcome in, welcome in. Going to go to Instagram first, then to Facebook, then to YouTube, jimmyrants.com. See what you have to say about this one. Good stuff, says Joshua. I thought so, Joshua. We need to be seeing some good news out there because unfortunately they keep pushing low saturated fat diets as if they're everything and they're really nothing. All right, you guys are pretty quiet today, so let's see if anybody's talking over here on Facebook. What's up, guys? Thanks for being here. Kira says, oatmeal sprayed with glyphosates always say heart healthy too, so how healthy is it? Oh, that's a whole nother issue, Kira, that I don't have enough time in the world on this Jimmy Rants to get into today, but thank you for that. You guys are just like absorbing this one today. Not much comments. Okay, there's a bunch of comments on YouTube. Let's see what you guys have to say. Gossip Gay says, this is all very informative. Thank you. Cut those brain zombifying carbs, says Edith. That's a good description, Edith. Let's all listen to folks like the Banana Fruity Loop. She is our messiah to anorexia and wasting away. Aw. John Yudkin, we failed you. Why didn't we listen? You tried to school us. Profuse tears and frustrated wall pounding. Yeah, John Yudkin in the early 70s was trying to combat the Keys hypothesis of lowering your fat to improve your heart disease. And yeah, you're right, Edith. He was spot on. People like me and my type 2 diabetic fellows think the pills and shots, and it disappeared. Let's try that again. I was reading it and suddenly it disappeared. Oh crap. It did it again, Edith. I went to read your article or what you wrote, and then it just totally zapped your comment. YouTube, get your act together. I can't read comments if they disappear on me. So when I eat more saturated fat, I feel full longer and don't overeat. And see, that's the thing, Kira, too. none of these studies do they look at what the effects are of those diet. They just say cut your saturated fat and cut your cholesterol. They don't talk about it causing more hunger, causing more cravings, causing you to want to eat more. None of that comes into play. And of course, if a doctor sees that, well, let me give you a drug that will dampen down your cravings. No, we need to look at why we're having cravings. And you're having cravings because you're not eating enough fat, which would give you satiation. That's a whole nother story altogether that they're just not even bringing into the conversation. So guys, I hope you were encouraged by this today. If you ever feel like, man, why can't they just get it, that it's not about high cholesterol because of saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet, it really is the carbs. Well, now we have brand new evidence in this study that I shared about here today that underscores that very thing. And it should give you hope that we do have some promising stuff coming. I can tell you behind the scenes, there is a whole lot of research looking at low carb diets, ketogenic diets, and how they will help various aspects of health. So stay tuned, stay encouraged. Just know that I will keep you on the cutting edge here on Jimmy Rants. I will always bring those kinds of things to your attention because, you need to be encouraged and know that what you're doing is pretty good. Now, I do have another story that I will get to on a very soon Jimmy Rants, all about the coronary calcium scoring as a preventative measure. So stay tuned for that, because this is something not enough doctors are doing, and I've got a whole lot of education and experience about that one as well. Again, if you want to learn more about cholesterol and the truth about it, here is my book that I wrote. It's called Cholesterol Clarity, What the HDL is Wrong with My Numbers. It is available in hardback, Kindle, and Audible audiobook if you want to check it out. But we went into a deep dive of all the things regarding cholesterol and what matters, what doesn't matter. And shocker, total cholesterol and LDL don't matter as much as you think they do. So check that one out. And thank you for watching today. And that's it for this episode of Jimmy Rants. JimmyRants.com is the website. And as always, you can engage live in the content, but you got to go follow me right here on Instagram. I am at Living Low Carb Man, LIVINLOWCARBMAN. Once you're there, engage live, hang out, check out my page, look at my stories, do a lot of fun stuff here. And then we go live here on Jimmy Rants, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. So be there, be square. We also simulcast live over here on my Facebook page. So thank you guys for being here today. We also simulcast on my YouTube stream. And you're all my big fat family here today. I just love having you guys come here every single day. It's so gratifying to be able to come and share information with you here in this format. If you missed a live here on Instagram, you can actually watch it on replay on IGTV right here on Instagram. We also throw the past episodes up over on YouTube. So type in a keyword Jimmy Rants, you'll find the show. Also, don't forget today's episode of the Living La Vida Low Carb Show podcast, LLVLC.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts. We feature a best of Jimmy Rants, which features that study that came out in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology that talked about saturated fat not being the grand enemy in our health that I did recently. So go listen to that today on my podcast. And then finally go to JimmyRants.com. You can see all the past episodes. And if you get good information here, then you can definitely help me out by clicking on that Patreon link. And really a donation of any amount would be greatly appreciated. That's it for now, you guys. I'll be back again real soon with more Jimmy Rants. See ya.